Maybe it'd be helpful at this point, Josh, to talk about how we get from like there being like an unlimited foundation or necessary thing to it being like supreme, which is something you were
Yeah.
hinting at earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So first, I want to avoid being overly triumphal about this argument. And I was actually just thinking about the argument again last night and this morning and just kind of turning over the pieces and maybe distinguishing pieces that are clear in my own mind from things that are maybe less clear. And I wrote down some notes. I was thinking that kind of just slowing things down and thinking about maybe what's the most clear. I was thinking about some attributes of the fundamental attributes. So just to bring this back up, let's just say that this bit of reality represents dependent realities, and then let's say that this foundational reality, whatever it is, just represents the non-dependent, independent foundation. And then let's say that doesn't have any particular arbitrary limits in its fundamental description. And so now you're wondering, okay, well, why think that if it doesn't have arbitrary limits in its fundamental description, that it would be supreme? Now, to even answer that question, I want to take a little bit of time to think about, like, what would it even mean to be supreme?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I wrote this down in my notes, just kind of taking a step back and thinking about its foundational attributes, I wrote down 4 attributes of its foundational attributes. And I think it'd be worth to kind of us just kind of stepping through those 4, because
Yeah.
I think stepping through those 4 will even help me to clarify a way of understanding what it means to be supreme. So, here's our reality, and it has some attributes. But let's say that some of its attributes are fundamental attributes, so they don't have any further cause or explanation. And let's just take all of its fundamental attributes, and let's let n for nature be the name of the total of all of its fundamental attributes. Okay. So now the question is, what attributes are included in n? Okay. So what attributes are included in the fundamental nature of the fundamental reality? That's our question. And so I have 4 attributes of the attributes in n that I want to just kind of point to, and maybe you can talk back with me about some of these.
Yeah.
So the first attribute of the attributes is that these attributes are going to be what I call qualitative as opposed to quantitative.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that, this goes back to that principle of slight differences rooted in the principle of irrelevant differences. So to illustrate, um, if one of the attributes in n were, let's say, being a triangle, then that triangularity, that number 3 that shows up in, that's a quantitative attribute. And then I wonder, okay, well, why is it triangular rather than square? It seems like that's not a relevant difference. And so to avoid this problem of irrelevant differences, I say that, well, it's not a quantitative property at all. It's a qualitative. So an example of a qualitative property would be, or maybe we could say categorical property, like being independent or being something. Okay, those don't have quantities built into them. Being the ground of all else, being foundational. Okay, it could have those attributes. Maybe some of those attributes are even included in n, but it wouldn't have a quantitative attribute. So that's the first thing, is qualitative. The second attribute of the attributes in n of the fundamental nature would be that it's, we already mentioned this, it wouldn't be limited. It wouldn't be limited, and that's because, one question you might ask me, well, what do I mean by a limit? One way of defining a limit would be, it's a quantitative attribute that's not maximal. So maybe there are some quantitative attributes that are maximal. So it's as high as could be. But a quantitative limit that's not maximal, I think that sort of calls for an explanation of, like, well, why does it have that quantity rather than more or less? So sort of for the same reason that it's not quantitative, it wouldn't then be limited in that sense, in the sense of being a quantitative attribute that's not maximal. I mean, obviously, if it's not a quantitative attribute, it's not a quantitative attribute that's not maximal. That just follows by definition. So those two are kind of related. And then the second 2 have to do with the positivity of the attribute. So I was talking about this with my wife, Rachel, and she reminded me that the word positive is kind of ambiguous. One way of thinking of the word positive is in terms of just logical positivity, like it doesn't include a negation. So like being snow is positive, but being not snow, the not in there, is negative because it has the not. Okay. So that's a kind of logical positivity. My thought is that if it had a negation in there, like not being a unicorn, that's going to be grounded in terms of something that it is. Like the reason that it's not a unicorn is because it is something that precludes being a unicorn. So if that's right, then the fundamental nature, which isn't grounded in anything, is not going to include these logical negations. It's going to be just purely positive, logically positive. And then here's the fourth one. This is going to be related to an argument for its having a supreme nature. Is I think that it would have a positive aspect in the sense of value. So you call this axiological positivity. And I was thinking about this again and trying to get it very, very clear in my mind. There's different ways of unpacking this, but maybe at the general level, we could think of it this way. We could think that if this foundational reality didn't have any positive aspects at all at its fundamental layer, then it would be an insufficient basis for other positive aspects it has. And by positive, I mean some kind of value in telling quality. So, for example, it seems to me that it has value in virtue of having this ability to be a ground of everything else. And the ability to being a ground of everything else is a kind of value in telling quality. But if it were purely not valuable in the foundational layer of it, then that lack of value would be an insufficient resource or an insufficient basis for its having value. The idea is that you can't get value purely from non-values is maybe the way to put it in a slogan. Value derives from value. And I was thinking again about examples of this. I mean, it's like if somebody has lots and lots of wisdom, having lots and lots of wisdom, you might think, is a value entailing quality. It's valuable for you to have wisdom. And now if let's say that you're wise about relationships, okay, then that's also value entailing quality. And having wisdom about relationships also entails having wisdom about something. Now, I know this is getting subtle and technical, but I think it's worth being careful about this to see what's going on here. Is that if you have two different properties, like having wisdom about something and having wisdom about relationships, both of those you might think are value entailing, but the value of having wisdom about something is explained or grounded in the value of having wisdom about relationships, or at least it could be. And so what I'm illustrating here is the idea that you can have valuable properties that are grounded in other valuable properties. And then this illustrates the general principle that in general, valuable properties, if they have any grounds at all, are going to be grounded in other valuable properties. They're not going to bottom out in pure non-value. And so this would be a reason that you might have to think that the fundamental nature, fundamental reality, then has some positive or positive aspect or some kind of value. But then it would have that in a qualitative way, not in a quantitative way, because the fundamental nature is not quantitative, and it wouldn't be an arbitrarily limited value. And then at this point, you might think of the word supreme as what it means to have this fundamental value without limit. You might sort of define it this way. And let me just say, this is a place in the argument that I don't feel like I have crystal clarity on it. I mean, I was thinking today as I was kind of preparing in my mind for our conversation, I was thinking about how valuable it is, I think, when people are working through something to also kind of highlight the places where they're not so sure, even in the process. And the reason for that is because I think otherwise what we can end up doing is we can only convey when we feel confident, and then people don't get the wisdom for what to do when you don't feel confident. Like how do you think about things when you're not sure? And so one of the things that I'm not so sure of is whether those four attributes that I just listed, the attributes of the attributes, are themselves a way of characterizing what it means to be supreme, where that's how we can understand what a supreme nature is, or whether in addition, we actually can have insight into a supreme nature kind of like directly. And just to draw this out just a little bit more, and then I'll be curious to see what you think of this. One thing that I've wondered, and I've talked about this in my book, How Reason Can Lead to God, is if there's this attribute, which I call perfection, sometimes philosophers call this absolute perfection, which is something that we have an insight, a positive insight into through the window of our concept of a perfect being. So we look through the window of our concept of a perfect being, and through that window we see this nature, this perfection. And then this perfection actually has those 4 attributes that I just mentioned. It's qualitative, it's not quantitative. It's not an arbitrary limit. It's positive, okay? Both in the logical sense, it's not a negation of something, as well as in the axiological sense, because it's value conferring. And it's value conferring in the highest way, because again, it's not arbitrarily limited. So it would sort of maybe even imply what some people call maximal greatness. Now, maybe that's going farther than we need to go for this argument, but at least that there is this idea of this perfect, purely positive nature. And if there is this purely positive nature, then that might then solve the problem of arbitrary limits and irrelevant differences. The problem of arbitrary limits is that limits call for further explanation. The problem of irrelevant differences is that it seems like any other nature would have some kind of feature that seems to call for further explanation. It would still be like the other natures that have an explanation. So just to kind of summarize the idea is that, and I know this is a lot, and I don't want to be overly triumphal about this at all. And I'm not just saying this because I feel like there's areas here to explore further and to get clearer. And people watching this might hear some of this and might stimulate some ideas in your mind, maybe first in the form of an objection or maybe in the form of clarifying something more. But what I would say is kind of the clearest to me is that if there's this foundational reality, it's got to be relevantly different from caused explained things. And if this fundamental reality has a supreme nature, then I think it would have a relevant difference from cause and explained things. The kind of thing that would be supreme is precisely the kind of thing that wouldn't depend on other things. It's the kind of thing then that can exist independently and fully be the ground of everything else. So there you go. That's the complete form of the argument.